Hey there, welcome back to the channel. Today's story isn't just another tale, it's a journey through unexpected stops, unseen battles, and the quiet power of resilience. It's about what happens when life pushes you to the edge, when judgment isn't just from others, but from the very system that's supposed to protect you. If you've ever felt betrayed, unheard, or underestimated, this one's for you. So buckle up, because what you're about to hear might just change the way you see your own struggles and remind you that sometimes the most powerful victories come from breaking the silence and choosing a legacy over revenge. It was a quiet Thursday evening in Atlanta, the kind of dusk where the sky bruises purple before slipping into night and the air feels like it's holding its breath. Derek Miles had just wrapped up a long day at the Justice Department, another stack of paperwork, another round of strategy meetings, another coffee gone cold. He wasn't in a rush. He never was. Derek had learned that life, like the law, was best approached with patience, clarity, and calm. He was 2 blocks from home, gliding through a familiar stretch of residential street, when the red and blue lights flared in his rearview mirror. His heartbeat didn't spike, not anymore. This wasn't his first stop, not in this city, not in his skin. Derek flicked on his signal, slowed, and pulled over by a row of shuttered storefronts. His hands rested on the wheel, visible, steady. He turned down the jazz humming through his speakers and waited. The officer approached slowly, hand hovering by his hip, mirror shades on even though the sun had all but gone. His name tag read Harlan, older, gruff. The kind of presence that said he'd been on the force longer than most and thought it gave him the right to decide what respect looked like. Evening, Derek offered, polite, even. Was I speeding? Harlan didn't answer the question. Instead, he peered into the vehicle, eyes scanning the interior like it was a crime scene. License and registration, he said flatly. No explanation, no context. Derek complied, slowly, smoothly. He'd practiced this, like a ritual. Harlan glanced at the documents, then back at Derek. What do you do for work, Mr. Miles? The question was casual on the surface, but something in the tone. It wasn't curiosity. It was suspicion cloaked in professionalism. I work in compliance, Derek said. Government sector. Harlan's eyebrow ticked up just barely. And what kind of compliance would that be? Internal risk oversight, state level. There was a pause. Barely a breath, but in that beat something shifted. Not in Derek. In Harlan. A flicker of something. Unease? Contempt? Well, the officer finally said, interesting. Step out of the vehicle for me. Derek blinked. Is there a reason, officer? Standard check. You got anything illegal in the car? No, sir. Then it won't be a problem. In that moment, everything around Derek seemed to still, not because he was afraid, but because he recognized the crossroad, the fork that too many had walked before him, the one where calm men became headlines, where careers, reputations, lives unraveled because someone mistook confidence for threat. And here's the twist. Derek wasn't the one being tested, not really. The real test was for Officer Harlan, because this wasn't just about a stop. This was about power and what people do when they think no one's watching. And Derek Miles, he was watching everything. And as Harlan circled the vehicle, asking questions that had nothing to do with traffic, the line between law and judgment began to blur. And that's when Derek realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was something much more dangerous, something personal. Derek stepped out of the car slowly, the soft clack of his shoes on the pavement echoing louder than it should have in the still evening air. He could feel the shift, not in the breeze, but in the balance of control. What had started as a routine traffic stop was becoming something else entirely. The street was empty, the shops shuttered, and the only eyes on them belonged to a flickering street lamp and the low-hanging moon. Harlan didn't say much. He circled the car like a predator evaluating whether his prey was worth the energy. You live around here? He asked, tone clipped. Derek nodded. Yes, 2 blocks up. I've been in this neighborhood for years. Harlan muttered, barely concealing the skepticism. He looked Derek up and down, his tailored coat, his clean car, his calm demeanor, and somehow all of it seemed to offend him. There was no accusation, not yet, but there was judgment. The kind that simmers under the surface of polite conversation, masked as curiosity. That's when it became clear this wasn't about the law, not anymore. This was about perception. There's a subtle but dangerous shift when those with power stop enforcing the law and start enforcing their opinion of you. And for Derek, a black man in a nice car in a decent part of town at the wrong time of night, Harlan had already made his assessment, not based on evidence, but based on what he thought should be true. It's a feeling that many people know too well. When someone in authority doesn't see your credentials, your years of work, your intent, they only see a stereotype they've been taught to expect. And even if you pass every test, answer every question, stay composed, it might not be enough because the goalpost keeps shifting. You said government work, Harlan said. You don't look like a government guy. Derek kept his voice even. I handle fraud investigations and oversight. Sounds like you know how to hide things then. It was a baited hook, cast with a smirk, but Derek didn't bite. Instead, he looked Harlan in the eye and said calmly, sounds like you're reaching. Silence. Harlan's jaw tightened. The air grew thick. Then came the twist, small, almost invisible, but life-altering. Another car pulled up behind them. Civilian, quiet. A woman stepped out, phone in hand. Recording. I'm his neighbor, she called out. Is everything okay, officer? Just like that, the moment cracked. The invisible leash tugged. Harlan straightened up, posture stiff. A pause, then a forced smile. We're just having a conversation, ma'am. Everything's fine. But it wasn't, because the presence of that phone, the digital witness, shifted the power again. Suddenly, the officer wasn't just facing Derek, he was facing accountability. And that's the quiet tragedy of it all. Justice shouldn't depend on being watched. As Derek got back into his car and watched Harlan retreat, he couldn't help but wonder, why had this small interaction carried such weight? Why did it leave a mark deeper than expected? That's when his mind drifted, not to this moment, but to one from long ago, one that had changed everything. The next morning, the incident should have faded into memory, just another uncomfortable blip in the long string of Derek's cautious life. But it lingered, like a bruise beneath the skin, not because of the stop itself, but because of what it represented, the weight of accumulated misjudgments, the quiet violence of being doubted in your own skin. Derek sipped his coffee in silence, staring out his kitchen window. He thought about all the times in his life when people hadn't said anything explicit, but everything about their behavior spoke volumes, like the colleague who always double-checked his reports, even though Derek's audits were spotless, or the neighbor who clutched her purse tighter when they passed each other in the hallway, or the security guard at the conference who asked to see his badge twice. These weren't the kind of wounds you could show. They didn't leave scars, just shadows, death by 1,000 paper cuts. And yet most of the world called it nothing. That was the brilliance and the cruelty of microaggressions. They were designed to be deniable, easy to dismiss, easy to blame on oversensitivity. He probably didn't mean it like that. Maybe you're just reading into things. Don't be so defensive. But what most people didn't realize was that being forced to constantly defend your right to exist without suspicion was exhausting. It reminded Derek of a moment years ago during a prestigious graduate fellowship interview. He had arrived early, suit pressed, documents neatly organized. The woman at the reception desk didn't look up when he approached. Deliveries go through the side entrance, she said flatly. He had smiled gently. I'm not here for deliveries. I'm here to interview for the Rhodes shortlist. The silence that followed, thick. She looked up. The pause, the wide eyes, the apologetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, my mistake. It wasn't a mistake, it was a lens. And it never stopped. That's what gnawed at Derek now. The stop the night before hadn't been an isolated incident. It had simply activated a lifetime of unspoken judgments. But here's the real twist. Despite everything, Derek never let those cuts define him. He used them. Each misjudgment taught him something about grace, about holding his center when the world tried to knock him off balance, about never letting someone else's limited view of him shrink his own vision. Because if he had let them, those tiny daily offenses, chip away at his confidence, his dignity, his self-worth, he would have become invisible in his own story. Instead, he made a choice, not just to survive them, but to name them, because naming them gave him back control. But naming injustice wasn't always enough, especially when the people behind it wore the badge of authority. As Derek would soon discover, the uniform that should have protected him was hiding something darker, something personal, something that would follow him far beyond that traffic stop. For a long time, Derek thought the badge on his chest was his shield, a symbol of order, a promise to protect. But that illusion began to crack not from outside attacks, but from within. After the traffic stop and the waves of subtle disrespect that followed, something shifted. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about what it exposed, a quiet hierarchy within the system he had pledged to serve. It started in a meeting, a routine departmental review. Derek was asked to step in for a colleague as he presented the case, clean facts, strong evidence, airtight logic. He noticed something strange. Captain Ellison, a man known for his stoic silence, leaned back, arms crossed, and smirked. Then came the questions, not about the case, but about Derek's approach, his tone, whether he was too assertive, whether community rapport was suffering under his lead. He had heard this before, but in different words, and never so cloaked in corporate civility. It wasn't criticism. It was control disguised as concern. Power, Derek realized, wasn't held by those on the front lines. It was shaped behind closed doors, in glances exchanged across polished oak tables, in who got the benefit of the doubt and who got follow-ups. And the power he thought he had earned, it was conditional, performative. It could be revoked silently without explanation. The deeper twist came weeks later, when a junior officer, white, less experienced, with a history of missteps, was promoted over him. The rationale? Leadership potential. It hit like a sucker punch. Not because Derek wanted the title, but because it proved what he feared. He wasn't part of the inside circle. He was a pawn, useful for optics, but never truly invited to shape the game. In a moment of reflection, Derek asked himself a question no academy had ever prepared him for. Is integrity still power when the system rewards compromise? That question haunted him more than any criminal ever had. And here's where the lesson bites hard. Power isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with stripes or stars. Often, real power is invisible. It's the unspoken permission to be mediocre and still rise. It's the room you walk into where you don't have to prove your worth every single time. For many listening right now, this isn't just Derek's story. It's yours. Maybe it's not a precinct. Maybe it's a boardroom, a classroom, a family. But the feeling is the same when you play by the rules and still get benched while others fumble and get cheered. So what do? Derek didn't quit. Not yet. But something hardened in him. Not bitterness, clarity. He began to document every meeting, every decision, every double standard. Quietly, patiently, not for revenge, but for leverage, because if they weren't going to give him power, he was going to learn how to take it without asking. And just when he thought he'd seen the full extent of the imbalance, a knock came at his door, one that would expose everything, not just about his precinct, but about himself. We'll go there next. It had been weeks since that traffic stop, but the memory lingered like a question with no answer. Derek replayed it in his mind often. The woman's calm, the way she looked at him, not with fear, but with quiet disappointment. It gnawed at him. She had said so little, and yet it felt like she knew something he didn't. Then one morning, just before his shift, a letter arrived at the station. No return address. Inside a single sheet of thick cream paper, handwritten. The message was short. He judged too quickly. Maybe I did too. Come see me. 12 p.m., Carver Community Center. His heart skipped. Mariah Grant, the woman from the stop. Curiosity won out over protocol. At noon, dressed in plain clothes, Derek stepped into the modest brick building that housed the Carver Community Center. He expected a tense conversation, maybe even confrontation. What he got instead was unexpected. Mariah wasn't waiting in an office. She was in the main hall, surrounded by kids, elders, and volunteers. She was leading a workshop on restorative justice. Around the room were photos, news clippings, testimonials, not about her, but about the lives she'd helped rebuild, victims of systemic failure, families torn by incarceration, stories of reconciliation. Derek stood quietly at the back until she saw him. She didn't flinch, just smiled gently and said, "I'm glad you came." They sat outside afterward under the shadow of a willow tree. That's when she said it. "I'm not just a driver, Officer Cole. I was a public defender for 16 years. Now I teach communities how to protect themselves when the system forgets to." It hit him like a thunderclap. The woman he had mentally reduced to a routine citation had spent years fighting battles he barely understood. He had seen her through the lens of uniform authority. She had seen him through the scars of institutional failure. They were two people standing on opposite shores of the same river, each convinced they held the truth. Mariah didn't scold. She listened, and in that hour, Derek saw more than just the flaws of a system. He saw his own blind spots. The twist wasn't just her identity, it was the revelation that power isn't always visible, that some of the most influential people walk quietly, without titles, without applause. And more importantly, he realized that not all battles are won with force. Some are won with presence, with patience, with the refusal to give in to bitterness. The lesson? Never assume you know someone based on the surface. The person you dismiss might be the very one who holds the key to your growth. Authority doesn't make you right. Curiosity and humility might. As they parted ways, Mariah handed him a small card. On the back, a single line, "Learn to listen without armor." Derek placed it in his wallet, right next to his badge. But this wasn't the end, because that same afternoon, as he returned to the station, a case file landed on his desk, one that would force him to make a choice between loyalty and truth. And that choice would change everything. Derek stared at the manila folder on his desk, unopened. His fingers hovered over the clasp, unsure, almost afraid. It wasn't just another case. The file bore the name of a fellow officer, someone he'd shared coffee with, responded to calls with, joked with during long, cold patrol nights. Officer Brent Lasky. A name that didn't fit the contents that were about to turn Derek's world upside down. When he finally opened it, the room seemed to still. Inside were a series of internal complaints, community affidavits, and one chilling body cam footage freeze frame. A young man, hands raised, fear in his eyes. The date on the footage? The same night Derek had pulled over Mariah Grant. Brent had been responding to a separate call a few blocks away, but his stop hadn't ended like Derek's. According to the report, the young man, Jalen Price, had been detained for non-compliance, but the footage painted a different story. Calm compliance, no raised voice, no threat, and still he was cuffed, bruised, and later released without charge. No paperwork, no trace, except this file. Derek's stomach turned. The echoes of Mariah's words, "Learn to listen without armor," rang louder now. He was faced with a choice: stay silent and protect the thin blue wall, or step forward and risk everything. It wasn't just about Brent. It was about the culture that made this feel normal, that normalized silence, justified aggression, and dismissed accountability in the name of unity. But unity without truth isn't unity. It's complicity. Derek brought the file to Captain Torres, an old school cop who once told him loyalty's everything. The room grew heavy when Torres finished reading. No emotion, just a long pause, then a quiet, "You sure you want to press this?" Derek didn't flinch. "Yes, sir." What followed was a blur. Internal hearings, press whispers, silent stares from fellow officers. Lasky, once a friend, now sat across from him in disciplinary review, disbelief on his face. "You too," he whispered. "I thought we had each other's backs." Derek's voice cracked but stood firm. "We do. That's why I can't let this slide." The backlash came hard. Isolation, muted conversations in the locker room, looks that lingered too long. But something else happened too. Quiet nods from younger officers. A rookie who stopped him in the hallway and said, "Thank you. I've seen things." I didn't know how to speak up. The twist wasn't just about exposing Brant. It was exposing the hidden cost of silence. That real loyalty doesn't protect wrongdoing. It protects the integrity of the badge. And as the department struggled with the weight of its own accountability, something unexpected happened. Derek received an invitation from Mariah. She was organizing a town hall. Victims, officers, citizens. No scripts, no legal shields, just stories. And Eland, as he read the invite, Derek realized this wasn't about ending a career. It was about starting a reckoning. The lesson? True strength isn't in covering mistakes, it's in owning them. Accountability isn't the enemy of trust, it's the foundation of it. But the next chapter wouldn't be so easy. Because at that town hall, someone from Derek's own past would rise to speak. Someone he never expected to see again. The church hall smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. Folding chairs lined up in uneven rows. A modest podium up front. Nothing fancy, just real people, real voices. Derek stood in the back, heart pounding beneath his jacket. He hadn't worn his uniform tonight. This wasn't a place for badges. This was a place for truth. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation. Victims of profiling, families of the unheard, and a few brave officers scattered among them. And there, near the front, sat Mariah, posture strong, eyes soft. She gave Derek a gentle nod, the kind that said, "You belong here," but also, "Don't hold back." People spoke, one by one. Some shared stories with trembling voices, others spoke with fire. A young woman recalled being searched in front of her 8-year-old daughter. A man recounted being mistaken for a suspect 3 times in 1 week. And then came a voice that froze Derek in place. "Some of you know me as Tasha Lee," the speaker said, stepping up to the mic. "But before that, I was just another case file." Derek's breath caught. Tasha. He hadn't seen her in years. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, gone to the same high school. She'd been funny, smart, full of fire, but one night, long before Derek ever wore a badge, she vanished from their shared world. Rumors swirled. Drugs, a bad crowd, a wrongful arrest. Now here she stood, transformed, yet carrying the same quiet intensity he remembered. At 19, she said, "I was arrested for a crime I didn't commit. Spent 8 months fighting to prove my innocence. No one apologized. They just moved on. But I couldn't." Her eyes scanned the room, then paused on Derek. "And the worst part," she added, "was knowing people I grew up with. Knew the system wasn't fair, but they said nothing." The words landed like a punch, not because she blamed him directly, but because he had been one of them. Silent, afraid, respectable from a distance, but complicit by omission. When the mic opened for responses, Derek's legs moved before his mind caught up. He didn't plan to speak, but something deeper had already made the decision. He stepped forward. My name is Derek Monroe. I've served 14 years in law enforcement, and I've stayed quiet for too long. The room stilled. I told myself I was one of the good ones, that if I didn't abuse power, I wasn't responsible. But I see now, my silence made space for harm. My inaction allowed patterns to repeat. Gasps. A few people leaned in, a few turned away, but Mariah, from the front row, smiled through tears. I can't change the past, but I can choose what I do now. That starts with listening, owning the damage, and not hiding behind the badge. He stepped back. A moment of silence followed. Then applause. Not loud, not overwhelming, but real. A woman in the third row wiped her eyes. A man clapped once, then kept clapping. One by one, others joined. The room felt less like a courtroom, more like a collective exhale. The twist wasn't just Derek speaking up. It was the realization that healing didn't require perfection. It required presence. Vulnerability was no longer weakness. It was responsibility. That night, Derek wasn't celebrated as a hero. He wasn't forgiven on the spot, but he was finally seen, not as a symbol of law, but as a man choosing to stand in truth. And as the lights dimmed, a young rookie officer approached him quietly. "I've been scared to say something," she said, "but you just gave me the courage." Derek didn't have the answers, but for the first time, he had his voice back. And the next test of that voice was coming soon. Because what he didn't know was that Brent had filed a retaliation claim, and things were about to get ugly. The City Hall conference room was colder than Derek expected, but the tension inside was enough to ignite a furnace. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as council members, department heads, and media gathered to witness the fallout from Derek's newfound voice. What began as a small community meeting had spiraled into a public reckoning, one that no one in the room could ignore. Derek sat at the center table, his hands folded but his mind racing. This was the moment where the ripples of courage collided with the fortress of power. Brent, his longtime colleague and now accuser, stood across the room, his face unreadable. The retaliation claim Brent had filed wasn't just paperwork. It was a strategic strike aimed at silencing Derek before his truth could dismantle the system from within. But Derek knew this wasn't just about him. It was about every unheard voice. Every hidden injustice buried beneath layers of protocol and politics. He glanced at Mariah, seated quietly nearby. She caught his eye and gave a subtle nod, a reminder that they weren't alone. As the hearing began, the room filled with formalities and rehearsed statements. Yet beneath the polished words lay a current of fear. Fear that change would cost too much. Fear that admitting faults would unravel the carefully maintained image of control. Then came the twist, the unexpected testimony of an internal affairs officer, quietly courageous, who revealed that Derek's accusations echoed concerns, whispered for years in back rooms but never spoken aloud in public. The officer spoke of a culture resistant to accountability, where power protected itself by dismissing dissent as betrayal. A hush fell over the room. Derek felt the weight of countless invisible struggles converge into this moment. The hall of power was no longer an impenetrable fortress. It was echoing with the voices of those demanding justice. The council's decision didn't come quickly. It wasn't a dramatic headline or an immediate victory. Instead, it was a series of small, deliberate steps, promises of review, commitments to transparency, and the formation of a community oversight committee. To many, it seemed like a mere formality, but to Derek, to Mariah, and to the silent masses, it was the first crack in a wall that had seemed unbreakable. As the hearing closed, Derek stepped outside into the evening air. The city's noise wrapped around him, cars, distant sirens, voices from crowded sidewalks. But beneath the chaos, there was a new rhythm, the steady beat of courage multiplied by action. And deep inside, Derek realized the true lesson. Power is not held by those who wield authority alone. It belongs to those who choose to speak, to listen, and to transform the silence into change. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. Because when the echoes in the hall of power grow loud enough, they can no longer be ignored. And those echoes, they carry the promise of a future shaped not by fear or silence, but by truth, resilience, and hope. Days turned into weeks, but the ripples from Derek's courage grew into waves impossible to ignore. The community's whispers became loud conversations. Local news outlets dug deeper, uncovering patterns of neglect and silencing that had long been brushed under the rug. What had started as a personal battle was evolving into a collective reckoning. Yet just when Derek thought progress was inevitable, a sudden twist shocked everyone. Internal reports that should have supported his claims mysteriously vanished, and key witnesses began retracting their statements, citing pressure and misunderstandings. The very system Derek challenged was fighting back, not with open dialogue, but with walls of obfuscation and denial. It was a brutal reminder. Accountability was not a given. It was a prize hard fought, often at great personal cost. Derek felt the sting of isolation, but refused to retreat. He knew the fight wasn't just about his story anymore. It was about every unheard voice, every injustice masked by silence. But here's the paradox. While the system pushed to bury the truth, Derek's resilience ignited something unexpected. Neighbors he barely knew stepped forward, sharing their own experiences of being overlooked or dismissed. Their stories became a chorus, transforming individual pain into collective power. This moment, the reckoning was not just about exposing flaws. It was about reclaiming agency in a world that often denies it. Derek learned that truth isn't always neat or clean. It's messy, tangled in fear, resistance, and sacrifice, but it's also the seed of transformation. The hardest lesson: real change demands relentless persistence and a community brave enough to stand together when the odds seem insurmountable. As Derek prepared for what lay ahead, he realized the reckoning was just the beginning of a longer journey, one fueled by the unyielding hope that even the most entrenched systems can be challenged by those who refuse to stay silent. From this reckoning rises the true power of a voice. And with that, the story moves into its final chapter. After the storm of the reckoning, Derek stood at a crossroads. The temptation for revenge, the urge to see those who wronged him brought down, was strong, almost natural. But deep inside, something had shifted. This fight was never about personal vengeance. It was about something far bigger, the legacy he would leave behind. Derek realized that revenge, while satisfying in the moment, often traps us in cycles of anger and pain. Instead, he chose a different path, a legacy built on resilience, justice, and the courage to speak truth to power. He understood that real change wouldn't come from tearing others down, but from lifting the vulnerable and rewriting the rules that kept them silent. In the weeks that followed, Derek channeled his energy into building community programs, creating safe spaces for voices long ignored, and pushing for reforms that would prevent future abuses. His story became a beacon not of bitterness but of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments we can choose to rise. Here's the twist. Those who once dismissed Derek began to listen, not because they feared him, but because they saw the strength in his compassion. The very system that tried to silence him was now facing pressure to evolve, led by the very person they underestimated. The lesson? True power isn't in retaliation, it's in transformation. Derek's legacy wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about inspiring a movement, proving that even the most broken systems can change when fueled by integrity and empathy. So as you listen to this story, remember, your struggles don't define you. What defines you is what you build afterward, the legacy you choose to leave behind. And with that, our story closes, not with an end, but with a beginning full of promise. What legacy will you choose? Thanks for staying with me through this journey. Derek's story shows us that while pain and injustice can knock us down, they don't have to define us. The real strength lies in rising and speaking out and in shaping a future where no one else has to suffer in silence. If this story moves you or sparks something inside, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, talk about it, and let's build a community where voices like Derek's are heard loud and clear. Remember, your legacy is waiting. Choose to make it one of courage, hope, and change. Until next time, take care and keep fighting the good fight.